The black stallion reared so high that the young trainer lost his grip and flew backward into the mud, landing hard against the fence rail. The crowd of stable workers gasped and pulled back as the horse spun in a tight, furious circle, nostrils flaring, eyes wide and wild. Dust rose around his hooves like smoke. The trainer scrambled away on his hands and knees, his face pale, his pride broken far worse than his body. Nobody moved to help the horse. Nobody dared. This was Titan, the finest and most dangerous horse ever to stand in the stables of Whitmore Hall. He had come to the estate 2 years earlier as a gift meant to prove the Duke's excellent taste in horses, a creature so beautiful that people traveled from other counties just to see him standing in his paddock. But beauty was not the word anyone used for him now. Now they called him cursed. Now they called him a killer waiting for his chance. 6 trainers had tried to ride him. 6 trainers had failed. The most recent, a man named Peter Grant who had once tamed racehorses for a royal stable, had sworn Titan would submit within a week. That was 3 weeks ago. Today, Peter Grant sat in the mud with a twisted wrist and a look of defeat that no one in the yard had seen on his face before. The head groom, an older man named Samuel Witt, ran forward with a rope, but even he kept his distance from the horse's swinging hooves. Titan snorted and backed toward the far corner of the paddock, watching every human with deep suspicion, his ears pinned flat against his skull. He looked less like a horse waiting to be tamed, and more like a prisoner waiting to escape. Standing apart from the noise and the shouting, near the water trough at the edge of the yard, a young woman named Arri Bennett watched everything with quiet, careful eyes. She did not gasp when the trainer fell. She did not join the others in whispering that the horse should be sold, or worse, put down before he seriously hurt someone. Instead, she watched the way Titan moved, the way his muscles trembled not with anger but with something closer to fear. She noticed how his eyes followed the whip in Samuel's hand long before Samuel raised it, and how his whole body flinched at the sound before any blow ever landed. Arri had worked in the stables of Whitmore Hall since she was a child of 9, taken in by Samuel after her parents died in a fever that swept through the village one hard winter. She had grown up sleeping above the hay loft, waking before dawn to feed the horses, and falling asleep each night to the soft sound of hooves shifting in their stalls. Horses had been the only steady thing in her short, uncertain life, and she understood them the way other girls her age understood books or music. She could read the shift of an ear, the flick of a tail, the way a horse held its breath, faster than she could read most words on a page. She was 20 years old now, plain in her work dress and boots, her brown hair always tied back and often escaping in loose strands around her face. Nobody at Whitmore Hall paid her much attention. She was simply the girl who mucked out the stalls, carried water, and mixed the feed. Nobody asked her opinion about horses, even though she had more understanding of them than every trainer who had ever walked through the gates. "That's it," Samuel called out, wiping sweat from his brow as Peter Grant limped away, cradling his wrist. "Nobody touches that horse again until the Duke returns. I won't have another man hurt because of that animal's temper." "He isn't a bad horse," Arri said quietly, almost to herself. But Samuel heard her, and he turned with a tired, almost amused expression. "Every trainer we've brought in has said the same thing before that horse threw them into the fence. You've been feeding him for 2 years, Arri. You know better than anyone what he's capable of." "I know what fear looks like," she answered, holding his gaze. "That's not a bad horse, Samuel, that's a frightened one." The other stable hands laughed, not unkindly, but with the easy dismissal people give to opinions they think don't matter. A girl who cleaned stalls had no business speaking about training a horse worth more than the entire estate's yearly income. Samuel only shook his head and told her to fetch fresh water for the horses that had actually behaved that day, and the moment passed like so many moments before it, unnoticed by everyone except Arri herself. But that night, long after the last lantern in the stable yard had been put out and the other workers had gone to their beds, Arri lay awake in the hay loft above Titan's stall, listening to him move below. She could hear him pace, back and forth, his hooves striking the wooden floor with a restless, uneven rhythm. He rarely slept through a full night. She had noticed that months ago. While the other horses dozed peacefully in their stalls, Titan stayed alert, as if waiting for danger that never quite arrived but never quite left either. She thought about what Samuel had said, about the temper the trainers all described, and she thought about the trembling she had seen in his muscles that afternoon. Two things could be true at once. A horse could be dangerous and afraid. A horse could throw a man from his back and still be desperate, somewhere underneath all that fury, for a single hand that did not come with a whip attached to it. Alara had heard whispers about where Titan came from before he arrived at Whitmore Hall. A trader down at the coastal market had sold him to the Duke's agent for an extraordinary sum, boasting about the animal's bloodline, his speed, his fire. But there were other whispers too, quieter ones, about how the trader had broken horses in his own particular way, with ropes pulled too tight and commands given too harshly, until the animals either gave up their spirit entirely or fought back with everything they had left. Titan, it seemed, had chosen to fight. Nobody at Whitmore Hall had thought to ask what had happened to him before he arrived. They had only seen the result: a horse too dangerous to ride, too valuable to sell, and too proud in his own strange way to simply give up. The Duke himself, Edmund Whitmore, had barely laid eyes on the horse since his arrival. He traveled constantly for matters of business, often gone for months at a stretch, leaving the running of the estate to his steward and the care of his animals to Samuel and the stable staff. He had paid a fortune for Titan, expecting to have the finest riding horse in the county, a creature that would turn heads when he rode into town or across his own wide fields. Instead, he had a horse he could not even approach, an expensive symbol of failure standing in his own paddock, and every letter from Samuel describing another failed attempt at training only deepened his frustration. There had even been talk, quiet and careful, among the staff, that if the horse could not be tamed soon, the Duke might order him sold at a loss, rather than continue paying for an animal that served no purpose beyond eating good hay and frightening visitors. Alara had heard this talk and felt something tighten in her chest each time, a feeling she did not examine too closely because she was afraid of what she might find there. She rose from the hay loft that night, careful not to make a sound, and climbed down the ladder in her bare feet, the wooden rungs cool beneath her skin. She had done this before, though never at night, never without the excuse of feeding or watering the horses. She simply wanted to see him, to sit near his stall in the dark and let the quiet settle around them both. Titan's ears flicked toward her the moment she stepped near his stall door, and his pacing stopped. He watched her with the same wary attention he gave everyone, muscles tense beneath his black coat, ready to bolt or strike if she came too close. Alara did not reach for him. She did not speak in the soft, coaxing tones people used with frightened animals, the tones that always seemed to make him more nervous rather than less. Instead, she simply sat down on an overturned bucket a few feet from his door and let the silence stretch between them. Minutes passed. Titan shifted his weight, snorted once, and watched her from the corner of his dark eye. Alara said nothing. She did not look directly at him, understanding instinctively that a direct stare felt like a threat to a creature already primed to expect one. She looked instead at her own hands folded in her lap, humming very softly under her breath, an old tune her mother used to sing when Alara could not sleep as a child. Slowly, so slowly that she almost missed it, Titan's ears relaxed. His head lowered an inch. He took one small step toward the stall door, then stopped, as if surprised by his own movement. Alara kept humming, kept her eyes down, kept her body still and unthreatening. Another step. His breath came out in a long, slow exhale that stirred the straw beneath his hooves. By the time the first hint of gray light touched the sky outside the stable, Titan stood at the very front of his stall, his nose almost close enough to touch the wooden bars, watching Alara with an expression that had shifted from wariness into something closer to curiosity. She had not touched him. She had not fed him a single treat or spoken a single coaxing word. She had simply sat with him through the darkest hours of the night, asking nothing of him at all, and for a horse who had spent 2 years surrounded by people who wanted only to control him, that quiet patience was something entirely new. Alara rose stiffly from the bucket as the roosters began to call from the yard, brushing straw from her skirt, careful to slip back up into the hay loft before the other workers arrived, and found her missing from her usual morning tasks. As she climbed the ladder, she glanced back once at the stallion below, and found him still watching her, his dark eyes following her every movement with an attention he had never given anyone else at Whitmore Hall. She did not know it yet, standing there in the pale morning light with straw in her hair and exhaustion pulling at her limbs, but something had shifted in that stall overnight, something small and fragile and entirely unnoticed by the rest of the world. A thread of trust had been tied between a frightened horse and a quiet girl who understood, perhaps better than anyone else at Whitmore Hall, that some wounds could not be fixed with force, no matter how skilled the hands trying to fix them. Down in the yard, Samuel was already shouting for the morning feed to be prepared, and Peter Grant, his wrist wrapped in cloth, was climbing into a cart to leave the estate for good, muttering that no amount of money could convince him to try riding that horse again. Word would travel fast through the county about another failed attempt, another trainer defeated by the Duke's impossible stallion. Nobody paying attention to that morning's gossip would have guessed that the true beginning of Titan's story had already happened, quietly in the dark, long before the sun ever rose over Whitmore Hall. Alara returned to her chores that day as she always did, carrying water, sweeping stalls, saying little to the others around her. But as she passed Titan's stall in the afternoon, carrying a bucket of feed for the horses further down the row, she noticed something that made her pause. He was watching for her. Among all the noise and movement of the stable yard, his eyes found her immediately and stayed on her, tracking her path the way he had never tracked anyone else before. She did not smile, not where anyone could see her do it, but something warm settled in her chest all the same. Whatever had happened in the darkness of that stall the night before, it was not finished. It had only just begun, and Alara understood with a certainty that surprised her that she would be back again that night, and the night after that, for as long as it took to earn the trust of a horse everyone else had already given up on. Days passed, and the pattern repeated itself each night. Alara waited until the stable yard fell completely silent, until Samuel's snoring could be heard through the thin wall of his small cottage near the gate, and until the last dog had settled by the kitchen door. Then she climbed down from the hay loft and made her way to Titan's stall, carrying nothing but herself and the quiet patience that seemed to come so naturally to her, and so rarely to anyone else who had tried to work with the stallion. On the third night she brought a small apple, not to bribe him, but simply to hold in her open palm, resting on the top rail of his stall door, well within his reach but never pushed toward him. Titan eyed the apple for a long while before finally stretching his neck forward and taking it gently from her hand, his soft lips barely brushing her skin. It was such a small thing, an apple eaten from an open palm, yet Alara felt her chest tighten with something like joy. No one else at Whitmore Hall had ever gotten close enough to feed him by hand. On the fifth night she opened the stall door itself, just a few inches, and stepped inside. Every muscle in Titan's body went rigid, and for a moment Alara feared she had moved too quickly, undone weeks of careful progress in a single reckless choice. But she did not retreat. She stood just inside the doorway, her back nearly against the wood, and waited. Titan snorted, stamped one hoof, then slowly, deliberately, turned his head away from her and resumed eating from the pile of hay in the corner of his stall, as if to say that her presence, though tolerated, was not yet welcome enough to interrupt his meal. It was progress all the same, and Alara treasured it the way a miser treasures gold, counting each small gain in the privacy of her own thoughts, never speaking of it to anyone in the daylight hours. Word of her secret nights might have stayed hidden indefinitely if not for a young stable hand named Cedric Marsh, who had joined the staff at Whitmore Hall only a year earlier and had taken an immediate dislike to Alara, though neither of them could have said exactly why. Perhaps it was simple jealousy, the kind that grows between two people competing for the same scraps of approval from an overworked head groom. Perhaps it was something deeper, some resentment Cedric carried from his own hard upbringing that made him quick to suspect others of getting away with things he himself had never been allowed. Whatever the reason, Cedric watched Alara with narrow, calculating eyes, and it was only a matter of time before he noticed her slipping out of the hay loft after the rest of the household had gone to sleep. He said nothing at first, only watched, curious to see where she went and what she was doing. When he finally followed her one night, keeping well back in the shadows between the stable buildings, he was astonished to see her enter Titan's stall itself, the same stall that 6 trained professionals had refused to approach without a rope and a whip in hand. He watched from behind a stack of feed barrels as she sat quietly in the straw, humming under her breath, while the stallion who had thrown grown men into fence rails stood calmly beside her, occasionally lowering his great head to nudge gently at her shoulder. Cedric did not understand what he was seeing, and what he did not understand, he distrusted. Rather than approaching Alara directly, he kept his discovery to himself for the time being, turning it over in his mind, wondering how such information might be useful to him. A stable boy with ambitions of becoming head groom himself, one day might find great value in knowing a secret that could either be used to elevate his own standing, or to bring down a rival who, in his mind, had somehow captured an achievement that should rightfully belong to someone more skilled, more experienced, more deserving than a simple orphan girl who mucked out stalls. For now, though, he simply watched and waited and said nothing. Alara, unaware that her secret had already been discovered, continued her nightly visits with growing confidence. By the end of the second week, Titan allowed her to run a soft brush along his neck and shoulders, something he had never permitted from any other hand at Whitmore Hall. The other horses in the stable, sensing perhaps that something unusual was happening in the stall beside them, grew calmer too, as though Titan's slowly softening temperament had a settling effect on the entire building. Samuel noticed the change first, though he did not know its cause. He remarked one morning to the other stable hands that Titan seemed less agitated lately, less prone to kicking at his stall walls during the night, and wondered aloud whether the horse was simply growing accustomed to his surroundings after 2 long years. Nobody thought to connect this improvement to Alara, who continued going about her daily chores with the same quiet, unremarkable manner she always had, giving no outward sign of the extraordinary thing happening each night after the household went to sleep. It was during the 3rd week that Alara took her boldest step yet. She had been brushing Titan's coat in the moonlight that filtered weakly through the stable's high windows, running the soft bristles along his back in long, even strokes, when an idea came to her that she had been circling for days without quite admitting to herself. She wanted, more than anything, to know what it would feel like to sit upon his back, not to ride him in any real sense, not yet, but simply to rest her weight there for a moment and see how he responded. She approached the idea carefully, the way she approached everything with him. First, she leaned her body gently against his side, letting him feel the pressure of her weight without any sudden movement. Titan flinched but did not pull away. She stayed like that for several long minutes, murmuring softly, stroking his neck with one hand while pressing her weight more firmly against him with the other side of her body. When he showed no sign of alarm, she moved slowly toward placing both hands upon his back, testing whether he would tolerate the added pressure. Titan's ears flicked backward, a warning sign that Alara had learned to recognize and respect, and she immediately stepped back, giving him space, letting him decide for himself how much he was willing to allow. She had learned, through weeks of patient observation, that force never worked with this horse, not because he was stubborn in the way people described him, but because force reminded him of everything that had made him dangerous in the first place. Only patience, only choice freely given, seemed to reach whatever part of him remained capable of trust. She did not attempt to mount him that night. Instead, she simply sat beside him in the straw as she always did, letting the small victory of his tolerance settle between them like a promise of things still to come. As she prepared to leave before the sun rose, she paused at the stall door and looked back at him, his dark form barely visible in the fading moonlight, and felt a surge of tenderness that surprised her with its intensity. She had come to care for this horse in a way she had never expected, a bond built not from ownership or duty but from shared patience, shared silence, and a mutual understanding that trust, once broken, could still be slowly, carefully rebuilt. Unknown to Alara, Cedric had continued his quiet surveillance, growing more convinced with each passing night that her secret was one worth exploiting. He began making careful notes in his own mind, cataloging the nights she slipped away, the hours she spent in the stall, the visible changes in Titan's behavior that only he, besides Alara herself, seemed to have noticed. He told himself he was simply gathering information, though a more honest accounting of his own motives might have revealed something closer to resentment curdling slowly into a plan. One evening, as the stable staff gathered for their evening meal in the small dining hall attached to the kitchen, Cedric found himself seated near Samuel and decided, almost on impulse, to test the waters of what he knew. He mentioned, in a tone he hoped sounded casual, that he had noticed the black stallion seemed unusually calm of late, and wondered whether Samuel had any theory as to why. Samuel, chewing thoughtfully on a piece of bread, admitted that he had no clear explanation, only that the horse's temperament seemed to be softening on its own, perhaps with time and familiarity. Cedric considered pressing further, considered revealing what he had witnessed in the darkness of the stable, but something held him back. Some instinct that told him information held in reserve was worth more than information given away too soon. He let the conversation drift elsewhere, content for now to watch and wait, gathering his evidence like a hunter patiently tracking prey through the underbrush, in no hurry to spring his trap before the moment was right. Alara, blissfully unaware of the eyes watching her secret hours, continued her work with Titan through the following weeks, each night bringing some small new development. She began to run her hands along his legs, checking for any old injuries that might explain the sensitivity she sometimes noticed when certain areas were touched. She discovered, through careful observation, a faint scar along his left flank, mostly hidden beneath his dark coat, that suggested some past injury, perhaps from the rough handling his previous owner had subjected him to before his arrival at Whitmore Hall. The discovery of that scar changed something in Alara's understanding of the horse she had come to know so intimately in the quiet hours of the night. Whatever violence he had endured before arriving at Whitmore Hall had left more than just a mark on his temperament. It had left a physical reminder as well, a scar that perhaps ached in certain kinds of weather, or throbbed with old memory whenever a hand pressed too firmly against that particular stretch of his side. She began, from that night forward, to be even more careful in how she approached him, mindful always of the old wound hidden beneath his beautiful black coat. As the fourth week of her secret visits drew to a close, Alara found herself standing beside Titan one clear, cold night, the stars bright and sharp overhead, visible through the high windows of the stable. She had grown so comfortable in his presence that she sometimes forgot, in these quiet hours, that this was the same horse who had thrown 6 trained professionals and earned a reputation for danger across the entire county. In the darkness of his stall, with her hand resting gently on his neck and his breath warm against her shoulder, he seemed instead like an old and trusted friend, patient and gentle, nothing at all like the wild, furious creature who reared and spun in the daylight paddock for anyone else who dared approach. She thought, standing there in the cold night air, about how strange it was that the same animal could be 2 such different creatures depending on who stood before him, and what that person asked of him. She thought, too, with a small twist of sadness, about how few people in her own life had ever offered her the same kind of patience she now offered Titan each night. She had grown up quickly after her parents died, expected to work hard and ask for little, valued mostly for the labor she could provide rather than for anything particular about who she was as a person. Perhaps that shared experience of being underestimated, of being seen only for surface qualities rather than deeper worth, was part of what drew her so strongly to this horse that everyone else had already written off as a lost cause. She did not know, as she made her way back to the hay loft that night, that her careful, secret work was about to be tested in ways she had not yet imagined, or that the fragile trust she had built with Titan over the past month would soon face its greatest challenge, brought about not by the horse himself, but by the quiet, watching eyes of a jealous young man who had decided at last that the time had come to act on what he knew. The confrontation Alara had not expected came on a rainy afternoon, when dark clouds pressed low over Whitmore Hall, and the stable yard turned to mud beneath a steady, cold drizzle. She was carrying a bucket of feed toward the far stalls when Cedric stepped out from behind the tack room, blocking her path with his arms crossed, and a look on his face that made her stomach tighten with sudden, sharp unease. "I know what you've been doing," he said, his voice low enough that no one else nearby could hear over the sound of the rain. "Every night after everyone's asleep, I've seen you go into his stall." Ilara set the bucket down carefully, buying herself a moment to steady her breathing before she answered. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, though her voice betrayed her with the smallest tremor. "Don't lie to me," Cedric said, stepping closer. "I've watched you for weeks. You've been training that horse in secret, and you never said a word to Samuel or anyone else. Why would you keep something like that quiet, unless you knew you weren't supposed to be doing it in the first place?" Ilara felt a cold wave of fear settle over her, not fear of Cedric himself, but fear of what his knowledge might mean for Titan. If word reached Samuel that she had been entering the stallion's stall alone, at night, without permission or supervision, she would almost certainly be forbidden from ever going near him again. Worse, if the Duke learned that his prized, dangerous horse had been handled in secret by an untrained stable girl, there was no telling what he might decide to do, whether out of anger at the deception or fear for what might have happened had things gone differently. "Please," she said quietly, abandoning any pretense of denial. "Please don't say anything. He's not dangerous, Cedric, not with me. I've been careful. I would never do anything to put myself at risk, and I would never do anything to hurt him either." Cedric studied her for a long moment, rain dripping from the brim of his cap, his expression unreadable. "What's in it for me if I keep quiet?" he asked finally. The question hung between them, ugly and transactional, and Ilara felt a fresh wave of anger rise up beneath her fear. She had spent weeks pouring her heart into building something delicate and rare with a frightened, wounded animal, asking for nothing in return except the small satisfaction of watching him learn to trust again. Cedric, it seemed, saw only an opportunity, a piece of leverage to be traded for whatever advantage he thought he could gain. "I don't have anything to give you," she said honestly. "I have no money, no favors to call in. All I can ask is that you consider what's actually at stake here. That horse could be sold, or worse, if the Duke decides he's too much trouble. What I've been doing might be the only chance he has left." Something in her voice, some genuine desperation beneath the careful control she usually maintained, seemed to give Cedric pause. He was not, despite his jealousy and his calculating nature, entirely without conscience, and the plea in Ilara's eyes reminded him, uncomfortably, of his own early days at Whitmore Hall, when he too had been an outsider hoping for a chance to prove himself worthy of trust. "I won't say anything," he said finally, though his tone carried no warmth. "Not yet, but I want to see this for myself, tonight. If you're really doing what you say you're doing, I want to watch." It was not the outcome Ilara had hoped for, but it was better than exposure, better than an immediate end to everything she had worked so carefully to build. She agreed, reluctantly, and that night, for the first time since her secret visits began, she was not alone in the stable as she approached Titan's stall. Cedric kept his distance, standing well back near the entrance to the barn, arms crossed, clearly expecting to witness some trick, some exaggeration on Ilara's part that would prove her claims false. Instead, he watched in growing astonishment as the horse who had thrown him bodily against a fence rail only weeks earlier during a botched attempt to help move him to a different paddock, now stood calmly beside Ilara, lowering his great head to nuzzle at her shoulder, tolerating her hands running along his neck and back without the slightest sign of aggression. "How," Cedric whispered, more to himself than to her, "how is this possible?" "Patience," Ilara said simply, not looking away from Titan. "He was never vicious. He was scared, and everyone kept treating him like a monster instead of trying to understand why he was acting the way he was. I just gave him time, that's all. Time and no pressure, and no expectation that he had to be anything other than exactly what he was in that moment." Cedric said nothing for a long while, watching the strange, quiet scene before him with an expression that had shifted from suspicion into something closer to grudging respect. Whatever plans he might have entertained about using this information against Alara seemed, for the moment at least, to fade beneath the simple, undeniable reality of what he was witnessing. He had never seen anything like it, not in all his years working with horses, and some part of him, buried beneath the jealousy and ambition that usually drove his actions, recognized that he was watching something genuinely rare. "I still don't understand why you kept it secret," he said eventually. "If you can really do this, Samuel would want to know. The Duke would want to know." "And what happens then?" Alara asked, finally turning to look at him. "They take him away from me, hand him over to some new trainer who doesn't understand what he actually needs, and undo everything I've built these past weeks. Or they decide it's too risky, too strange, a stable girl succeeding where trained professionals failed, and find some reason to stop me before I can finish what I've started. I don't trust anyone else to understand what's happening here, Cedric. Not yet. Not until he's ready." Cedric considered this, turning it over in his mind with the same careful calculation he usually applied to matters of his own advancement. "What if I told you I wanted to learn?" he said finally. "Not to expose you, to actually understand how you're doing this." It was not the offer Alara had expected, and she studied his face carefully, searching for some sign of deception or hidden motive. But whatever ambition still simmered beneath his words, there was also something that looked, unmistakably, like genuine curiosity, the kind that comes from witnessing something that challenges everything a person thought they knew about their own chosen craft. "I'll think about it," she said, which was not quite agreement but was also not a refusal. And Cedric, sensing that this was the best answer he was likely to get for now, nodded and left her alone with Titan for the remainder of the night. Their uneasy arrangement continued over the following days, Cedric watching from a distance during Alara's nightly visits, careful never to approach too closely or make any sudden movements that might startle the still cautious Stallion. Alara found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, grateful for his silent company, even if she remained wary of his true motives. Having another set of eyes to watch for anyone who might discover their secret gave her a small measure of comfort she had not realized she needed. It was during this period that Alara made her first true attempt to sit fully upon Titan's back. She had spent the preceding nights gradually increasing the pressure of her weight against his sides, testing his tolerance in small increments, always ready to step back if he showed any sign of genuine distress rather than simple wariness. On a clear, quiet night near the end of the 5th week, with Cedric watching silently from his usual spot near the barn entrance, Alara finally judged that the moment had come. She stood beside Titan in the straw, her heart pounding harder than she wanted to admit, and placed both hands firmly on his back, testing his reaction one final time before committing to the attempt. He shifted his weight but did not pull away. Slowly, carefully, she pushed herself up, swinging one leg over his back in a single smooth motion, settling her weight upon him for the very first time. For one long, terrifying moment, Titan went completely still, every muscle in his body rigid with tension. Alara held her breath, prepared to slide off immediately if he showed any sign of the fury that had thrown so many trained riders before her. But the moment stretched, and stretched again, and the explosion of movement she feared never came. Instead, Titan simply stood there, his ears swiveling backward to track her position, his breath coming in slow, deliberate exhales, as though he too was testing this new sensation, deciding for himself whether it was something he could bear. From his position near the barn entrance, Cedric watched with wide eyes, his hand pressed unconsciously against his own chest as though he too could feel the weight of the moment settling over the stable. He had seen grown men, experienced trainers, thrown violently from the same horse's back within seconds of mounting him. What he was witnessing now, a slight stable girl sitting calmly astride the supposedly untamable Stallion, defied everything he thought he understood about the animal. Alara did not move for several long minutes, simply allowing Titan to grow accustomed to the unfamiliar weight upon his back, murmuring softly, keeping her body relaxed and loose rather than tense and controlling. Gradually, she felt some of the rigidity leave his muscles, felt him shift his weight from one leg to another in a manner that suggested growing comfort rather than continued alarm. When she finally slid back down to the ground, her legs trembling slightly from the tension of the experience, she found herself laughing softly, a sound of pure, unrestrained joy that she rarely allowed herself in the daylight hours of her carefully controlled, unremarkable life. Cedric approached slowly once she had dismounted, careful not to startle Titan, who watched his approach with renewed wariness now that Alara was no longer touching him. "I've never seen anything like that," Cedric said quietly. "Not once in all the years I've worked with horses." "He's remarkable," Alara said, still slightly breathless, running her hand affectionately along Titan's neck. "He was ready. I could feel it. He's been ready for weeks, waiting for someone patient enough to let him decide for himself when he was ready to trust again." The weeks that followed brought steady, careful progress, each night building upon the small victory of that first successful mounting. Alara began to guide Titan through simple movements while seated upon his back, first within the confines of his own stall, later, once she judged him ready, within the small enclosed paddock behind the main stable building, chosen specifically because its high walls kept them hidden from the view of the main house and the rest of the estate. Cedric, true to his word, kept their secret, though his motives remained a complicated mixture of genuine fascination and lingering self-interest. He began asking Alara questions during their quiet nighttime sessions, curious about the specific techniques she used, the way she read Titan's body language, the patience she seemed to draw upon from some deep, inexhaustible well within herself. Alara answered his questions honestly, finding, to her surprise, that she did not mind sharing her methods with someone who had proven himself, at least for now, trustworthy enough to keep their secret and respectful enough not to interfere. But even as their fragile partnership grew steadier, a new concern began to weigh on Alara's mind. Letters had begun arriving more frequently from the Duke, inquiring after the progress of his troublesome stallion, his patience clearly wearing thin after so many months of expensive failure. Samuel, uncertain how to answer these increasingly pointed inquiries, had begun speaking openly among the staff about the very real possibility that the Duke might return to Whitmore Hall himself before the season's end, determined to see for himself whether the horse could ever be salvaged, or whether the time had finally come to cut his losses entirely. Alara knew, with growing urgency, that her secret could not remain hidden indefinitely. Sooner or later, the Duke would return, and when he did, he would expect answers about the horse he had invested so much money and hope in. The question that kept her awake during the few hours she allowed herself for rest was no longer whether her secret would eventually be discovered, but whether Titan would be ready, by the time that discovery came, to prove that everything she had worked toward these past weeks had been worth the risk she had taken in pursuing it. The first time Alara took Titan beyond the walls of the enclosed paddock came on a morning so early that the sky still held the deep blue of night at its edges, streaked faintly with the first pale hints of approaching dawn. She had grown confident enough in their bond over the preceding weeks to believe he was ready for open ground, for the wide fields that stretched beyond the stable yard toward the distant tree line, and she found herself unable to resist the pull of that vast, empty space calling to them both. She led him quietly out through the side gate, the one rarely used by the rest of the staff, and mounted him in the soft grass just beyond the stable walls, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and lingering caution that never quite left her, even after so many nights of careful progress. Titan tossed his head once, testing the open air around him, the freedom of unfenced ground clearly registering in some deep instinctive part of his nature. For a moment, Alara feared she had misjudged the moment, feared that the wide open field would trigger some wild, uncontrollable urge to run that she would be powerless to manage from her position on his back. But instead of bolting, Titan simply began to walk, his steps slow and measured, as though he too understood the fragility of the trust they had built and had no wish to shatter it with reckless movement. Alara guided him gently with the pressure of her legs and the soft touch of her hands, though in truth, she guided him very little at all. He seemed, in those early morning moments, to already know instinctively where she wanted to go, responding to the smallest shifts in her posture with an attentiveness that spoke of an intelligence far beyond what most people credited to horses. They rode together across the misty field as the sun began its slow climb over the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold that reflected off the dew-covered grass in 1,000 tiny points of light. Alara felt tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes, not from sadness, but from an overwhelming swell of emotion she struggled to name, some combination of pride and joy and profound gratitude for the unlikely gift of this moment. Riding freely across open ground on the back of a horse everyone else had already given up on. When they finally reached the edge of the tree line, Alara allowed Titan to slow to a stop, and they stood together in the growing light, both of them breathing hard, though from exertion rather than fear. She leaned forward and pressed her cheek briefly against his neck, murmuring soft words of gratitude and affection that she would never have dared speak aloud to another living soul, and felt him shift beneath her, a low, contented sound rumbling from somewhere deep in his chest, a sound she had never heard him make before. They returned to the stable just as the first of the roosters began their morning calls, and Alara slipped Titan back into his stall with practiced efficiency, removing any evidence of their early morning ride before the rest of the household began to stir. She climbed back up into the hay loft with her heart still pounding, not from the ride itself, but from the sheer, dizzying joy of what she had just experienced, and she allowed herself, for just a few moments, to imagine a future in which this secret joy might someday be shared openly, rather than hidden away in the darkest and earliest hours before the rest of the world awoke. This became their new routine over the following weeks, dawn rides across the misty fields before the household stirred, each morning bringing new confidence, new understanding between horse and rider. Cedric continued to keep their secret, though he no longer accompanied Alara on these early morning excursions, content instead to simply nod at her knowingly during their daily chores, a silent acknowledgement of the extraordinary thing happening beyond the awareness of everyone else at Whitmore Hall. But secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, have a way of straining under their own weight, and Alara found herself increasingly anxious about the growing risk of discovery. One morning, returning from their ride slightly later than usual, delayed by an unexpected mist that had made the fields difficult to navigate, she nearly ran directly into Samuel as she led Titan back toward his stall. The old groom stood frozen for a moment, staring first at Alara, then at the stallion beside her, standing calm and docile in a way he had never once witnessed in 2 long years of failed training attempts. "What," he said slowly, his voice thick with disbelief, "is going on here?" Alara's mind raced through a dozen possible explanations, none of them adequate to the situation before them. She considered lying, considered claiming she had simply been checking on the horse, and he happened to be calm that particular morning. But the sight of dew-damp grass still clinging to Titan's legs, evidence of their ride across the open field, made any such excuse impossible to sustain. "I've been working with him," she said finally, deciding that honesty, however risky, was her only real option. "At night after everyone's asleep, for weeks now. I know I should have told you, Samuel, but I was afraid you would stop me before I had the chance to prove it could work." Samuel's expression shifted through several stages of disbelief, confusion, and something that might have been the beginning of anger, before finally settling into a kind of stunned, careful curiosity. He approached slowly, the way a man might approach a rumor he desperately wanted to believe but could not yet fully trust, and reached out one weathered hand toward Titan's neck. The stallion flinched slightly at the unfamiliar touch, but did not pull away entirely, allowing Samuel's hand to rest briefly against his coat before shifting his attention back to Alara, as if seeking her reassurance that this new development was acceptable. 2 years, Samuel said quietly, shaking his head slowly. 2 years, 6 trainers, more money than I care to think about, and it was you all along working alone in the dark while the rest of us slept. I didn't want anyone to interfere before he was truly ready, Alara said, watching Samuel's face anxiously for some sign of how he intended to respond to this discovery. I know I broke the rules. I know I should have asked permission first. But I was afraid that if I asked, you would say no, and I couldn't bear the thought of losing this chance." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his hand still resting on Titan's neck, his eyes moving between the calm stallion before him and the anxious young woman who had somehow, against all odds and expectations, succeeded where so many trained professionals had failed. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the anger Alara had feared, only a kind of weary, astonished respect. "I should be angry with you," he said. "You took an enormous risk working with this horse alone without proper supervision. If something had gone wrong, if he had hurt you the way he hurt Peter Grant and the others, I would never have forgiven myself for not knowing what danger you were putting yourself in." "Nothing went wrong," Alara said quickly. "I was careful, Samuel, I promise you I was so careful." "I can see that," he admitted, gesturing at the calm, docile horse standing beside her. "I can see that clearly enough, but you understand, don't you, that this cannot remain secret any longer. The Duke will be returning within the month. He has written to say as much in his most recent letter. When he arrives, he will expect to know the full state of his investment in this animal, and I cannot in good conscience keep something of this magnitude from him." Alara felt a fresh wave of anxiety rise within her at the mention of the Duke's imminent return. She had known, in some abstract way, that this moment would eventually come, that her secret could not remain hidden forever, but hearing Samuel speak of it so directly, with a definite timeline attached, made the prospect suddenly, uncomfortably real. "What will happen," she asked quietly, "when he finds out? What will happen to Titan and to me?" Samuel considered the question carefully before answering, his weathered face thoughtful in the growing morning light. "I cannot say for certain how the Duke will react," he admitted. "He is not an unkind man, but he is a proud one, and I suspect it may sting his pride somewhat to learn that a stable girl succeeded where his hired experts failed. But I have known the Duke for many years, Alara, and whatever his pride might suffer in the moment, he has always valued results above all else. If you can demonstrate to him what you have shown me this morning, I believe there is every reason to hope for a favorable outcome." It was not quite the reassurance Alara had hoped for, but it was enough to ease some of the tightness in her chest, and she found herself nodding slowly, accepting the reality that her secret, guarded so carefully for so many weeks, would soon need to be revealed to the one person whose opinion mattered most for the future of both herself and the horse she had come to love so deeply. "In the meantime," Samuel continued, glancing around the stable yard to ensure no other staff members were within earshot, "I think it would be wise to continue your work with him, but perhaps with slightly less secrecy going forward. I will not report what I have seen to the Duke before his return, but I would ask that you allow me to observe your progress from time to time, so that I might better understand what you have accomplished and perhaps offer whatever support I can, now that I know the truth of what has been happening these past weeks." Alara agreed readily, grateful for Samuel's unexpected support, and relieved that her secret, now shared with someone in a position of genuine authority, felt somehow less precarious than it had when she alone carried the full weight of its potential consequences. Over the following days, Samuel began quietly observing her nighttime sessions with Titan, watching with growing amazement as the stallion's transformation continued to unfold before his experienced eyes, a transformation he would have thought impossible had he not witnessed it himself. But even as Alara's confidence grew with each passing day, a persistent worry continued to gnaw at the edges of her thoughts. The Duke's return was drawing steadily closer, and with it, the moment when everything she had built in careful secrecy would finally be exposed to the judgment of the one person whose decision would determine the future of both herself and the horse who had, against all expectation, become the truest companion she had ever known. The storm arrived without warning on an afternoon that had begun clear and calm, the kind of sudden, violent weather that sometimes swept in from the coast with little notice, catching farmers and travelers alike unprepared for the fury it brought with it. Dark clouds rolled across the sky with alarming speed, and within the space of an hour, What had been a peaceful autumn day transformed into a scene of howling wind and driving rain that sent every person and animal on the estate scrambling for shelter. Alara had been leading Titan back from an afternoon walk along the fence line, testing his response to the sound of distant thunder that had begun rumbling across the horizon, when the storm broke fully upon them with terrifying suddenness. Lightning split the sky directly overhead, followed almost instantly by a crash of thunder so loud it seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. And Titan, despite all the trust and patience built between them over the preceding weeks, reacted with pure, primal terror. He reared violently, tearing the lead rope from Alara's hands, and bolted across the open field with the wind screaming around them and rain lashing down in stinging sheets. Alara shouted his name, running after him despite knowing the futility of trying to catch a panicked horse on foot, her heart pounding with a fear that had nothing to do with the storm itself, and everything to do with what might happen to Titan if he ran blindly into the darkening woods at the edge of the estate, where fallen branches and hidden roots could easily bring even the most sure-footed horse crashing down. She heard shouting behind her and turned to see Cedric and Samuel running from the direction of the stable, both men soaked through already, their faces etched with the same fear she felt clawing at her own chest. "He's headed for the tree line," she shouted over the roar of the wind. "We have to stop him before he reaches the woods." The three of them split up, each taking a different angle across the field in a desperate attempt to cut off Titan's path before he reached the dense trees ahead, where the danger of injury multiplied tenfold. Alara pushed herself harder than she had ever pushed her body before, her boots sliding in the increasingly muddy ground, her breath tearing painfully in her chest, driven by a fear so sharp it felt like something physical lodged beneath her ribs. She caught sight of Titan again just as he reached the first scattered trees at the edge of the woods, his black coat barely visible against the darkening sky, and watched in horror as he stumbled, his front legs catching on some hidden obstacle in the underbrush, sending him crashing down onto his side with a terrible, heavy sound that carried even over the noise of the storm. "Titan!" Alara screamed, sprinting the final distance across the muddy field, her lungs burning, her vision blurred by rain and tears she did not have time to acknowledge. She reached him moments later, finding him struggling to rise, one of his front legs clearly favoring some injury sustained in the fall, his eyes wide and rolling with pain and terror in equal measure. She dropped to her knees beside him in the mud, heedless of the rain still pouring down around them, and pressed her hands against his neck, speaking to him in the same soft, steady voice she had used during all their quiet nights together, trying desperately to cut through the storm and the pain and the fear to reach whatever small measure of trust still remained between them. "I'm here," she said over and over, her voice shaking but determined. "I'm here and I'm not leaving you. Please, please try to stay calm. Let me help you." Titan thrashed once more, his uninjured legs kicking wildly in an attempt to rise, and for a moment Alara feared she might be caught beneath him in his panic. But she did not retreat, did not pull away despite every instinct screaming at her to save herself from the very real danger of remaining so close to a full-grown, terrified stallion in obvious pain. She kept her hands pressed firmly against his neck, kept her voice low and steady, kept her body as calm and still as she could manage despite her own racing heart. Samuel and Cedric arrived moments later, both men breathing hard from their run across the field, and stopped short at the sight before them, Alara kneeling in the mud beside the fallen, thrashing horse, seemingly unafraid despite the obvious danger of her position. "Alara, get back," Samuel shouted over the wind. "He could hurt you badly if he panics further." "He won't," Alara called back, not moving from her position. "Please just give us a moment. He needs to know I'm not going to abandon him." The two men exchanged a worried glance but held back, watching as Alara continued speaking softly to the injured horse, her hands never leaving his neck, her voice a steady anchor in the chaos of the storm around them. Slowly, gradually, Titan's thrashing began to ease, his breathing evening out despite the obvious pain still evident in the tension of his muscles, and the way he held his injured leg carefully away from the ground. "That's it," Alara murmured, tears mixing freely now with the rain on her face. "That's it, good boy, I know it hurts, I know you're frightened, but I'm here and I'm not going anywhere." With painstaking care, and with Samuel and Cedric finally approaching to help support his weight, Titan managed to rise back onto his feet, favoring his injured leg heavily but able, at least, to stand. The rain had begun to ease slightly, the worst of the storm's fury already passing over them, leaving behind a steady, softer drizzle that felt almost gentle compared to the violence of moments before. "We need to get him back to the stable," Samuel said, his voice tight with concern as he examined the visible swelling already beginning to form around Titan's injured foreleg. "That leg needs proper attention, and quickly, or we risk far worse damage than a simple strain." The walk back to the stable felt endless to Alara, every slow, careful step Titan took accompanied by a visible wince of pain that tore at her heart with each passing minute. She stayed close beside him the entire way, one hand resting constantly against his neck, murmuring soft encouragement, refusing to leave his side even when Samuel suggested she might be more useful running ahead to prepare warm water and bandages for his injury. "I'm not leaving him," she said firmly, and something in her tone left no room for argument. Once they reached the shelter of the stable, Samuel worked quickly and skillfully to examine the injury. His years of experience evident in the careful, practiced way he ran his hands along Titan's leg, checking for the telltale signs of a broken bone versus a simple strain or sprain. After several tense minutes, during which Alara held her breath and gripped Titan's halter with white-knuckled hands, Samuel finally straightened and delivered his verdict. "It's a bad strain," he said, relief evident in his voice, "but not broken. With proper rest and care, he should recover fully within a few weeks. We were fortunate, it could have been far worse." Alara felt her knees nearly buckle with relief, and she pressed her forehead briefly against Titan's neck, murmuring words of gratitude that were as much for the horse's resilience as for whatever fortune had spared him from a more serious injury. The days that followed brought a new phase in their relationship, one built not around the excitement of dawn rides across open fields, but around the quiet, patient work of nursing an injured animal back to health. Alara spent every spare moment she could find at Titan's side during his recovery, applying warm compresses to his injured leg, as Samuel had instructed, sitting with him through the long hours of enforced stillness that chafed so obviously against his naturally restless spirit. She read to him sometimes from the few worn books she owned, her voice low and steady, filling the quiet hours of his confinement with the comfort of sound and presence even when she had nothing practical left to offer beyond her company. Cedric, too, proved himself an unexpectedly valuable ally during this difficult period, taking on extra duties around the stable to free up more of Alara's time for Titan's care, and even learning, under her patient instruction, how to properly change the horse's bandages and monitor his healing progress. Whatever resentment or jealousy had once colored his view of Alara seemed to have faded almost entirely in the wake of the storm, replaced by a genuine admiration for both her skill with the injured horse and her unwavering dedication to his recovery. "I used to think you were just lucky," he admitted one evening, as the two of them sat together in the quiet stable, watching Titan doze peacefully in his stall for the first time since the accident. "I thought maybe the horse had simply never met the right kind of pressure to break him the way it had broken with the other trainers. But watching you these past few days, I understand now. It was never about luck at all." Alara accepted his words with a small, tired smile, too exhausted from days of careful nursing to fully articulate the complicated mixture of gratitude and lingering worry that still occupied her thoughts. Titan's leg was healing well, better than even Samuel had initially hoped, but the timeline of his recovery meant that he would not be fully sound again until just before, or perhaps precisely at, the moment the Duke was expected to return to Whitmore Hall. It was a cruel twist of timing, one that filled Alara with a fresh, sharpened anxiety as the days passed and Titan's recovery progressed. She had hoped, before the storm, to have him fully trained and demonstrably calm well before the Duke's arrival, giving herself ample time to prepare both the horse and herself for the difficult conversation that awaited them. Now, with his recovery still ongoing and his full strength not yet returned, she found herself facing the very real possibility that the Duke might arrive to find his prized stallion not gracefully transformed, but still visibly recovering from an injury sustained during what would surely look, to an outsider's eyes, like a reckless and poorly supervised training accident. She lay awake that night in the hay loft, listening to Titan's steady breathing below her, and allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, to fully confront the fear that had been building steadily beneath her determined optimism. What if the Duke arrived and saw only the risk, only the injury, only the unauthorized secrecy of her methods, without ever seeing the deeper truth of the trust and understanding she and Titan had built together through so many patient, quiet hours? What if, after everything, she lost him anyway, not through any failure of her training, but simply through the terrible, unfortunate timing of a storm neither of them could have predicted or prevented? These fears followed her into an uneasy, restless sleep, and she woke the next morning still carrying their weight, though she pushed them aside as best she could to focus on the practical work still required for Titan's continued healing. Whatever the future held, whatever judgment awaited them both when the Duke finally returned, she was determined to see this through to its end, to give Titan every possible chance at the future he deserved, regardless of the personal cost such determination might ultimately demand of her. 2 weeks into Titan's recovery, a letter arrived at Whitmore Hall that sent a fresh wave of urgency rippling through the entire household. Samuel called Arri into his small office beside the tack room one evening, his expression grave as he held the sealed letter bearing the Duke's own personal signature and crest. "He writes that his business abroad has concluded earlier than expected," Samuel said, reading through the careful, formal script. "He intends to return to Whitmore Hall within the fortnight, perhaps sooner, depending on the conditions of his travel. He asks specifically after the stallion, and states his intention to personally assess whether the animal should be kept, sold, or otherwise disposed of upon his arrival." The words landed like a physical blow, and Arri felt the careful calm she had been maintaining throughout Titan's recovery threaten to crack entirely. A fortnight, perhaps less. Titan's leg, though healing well, was still not fully sound, still bore the visible signs of recent injury that would be impossible to hide or explain away as anything other than exactly what it was. "That's not enough time," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "He needs at least another 2 weeks before he can bear his full weight properly again, before he can be ridden with any confidence. If the Duke arrives and sees him still favoring that leg, he'll assume the worst, that all this time and money have been wasted on a horse too damaged and too dangerous to ever be worth the investment." Samuel set the letter down carefully, his weathered face creased with genuine sympathy for the fear so plainly visible in Arri's expression. "I cannot control the timing of his return," he said gently, "but I can promise you this. When he does arrive, I will speak on your behalf and on Titan's behalf as well. I have seen with my own eyes what you have accomplished with that horse. Whatever judgment the Duke makes, he will make it with the full truth before him, not merely the surface appearance of a limping animal." It was cold comfort against the mounting dread building in Arri's chest, but she accepted it gratefully all the same, understanding that Samuel's support, freely given despite the risk to his own standing should the Duke disapprove of the secrecy that had surrounded Titan's training, was a gift she had no right to expect but every reason to treasure. The days that followed passed in a blur of careful, intensified effort. Arri doubled her attention to Titan's recovery, working closely with Samuel to develop a program of gentle exercise designed to strengthen his healing leg as quickly as possible without risking further injury through overexertion. She walked him slowly around the paddock each morning, gradually increasing the distance and pace as his strength returned, watching anxiously for any sign that she was pushing him too hard, too fast. Cedric proved himself an invaluable partner during this critical period, taking on additional responsibilities to ensure that Arri could dedicate every possible moment to Titan's rehabilitation without neglecting her other required duties around the estate. He had, in the weeks since the storm, become something closer to a genuine friend than the suspicious rival he had once been, and Alara found herself grateful more than once for the unexpected turn their relationship had taken. "You should rest," he told her one evening, finding her still in the stable long after the rest of the staff had retired for the night, carefully massaging some balm into Titan's injured leg by the dim light of a single lantern. "You've barely slept these past 2 weeks. Exhausting yourself won't help him heal any faster." "I can't stop," Alara said, not looking up from her work. "Not until I know he's ready, not until I know we've done everything possible before the Duke arrives." Cedric watched her for a long moment, concern evident in his expression. "And if it's not enough," he asked quietly, "if the Duke arrives and Titan still isn't fully recovered, what then?" Alara paused, her hands stilling against Titan's leg, and allowed herself, for just a moment, to consider the question she had been avoiding for days. "Then I'll have to trust that what we've built together, the bond, the trust, the understanding, means more than a temporary limp," she said finally. "I have to believe that if he sees us together, sees how far Titan has come from the horse who threw 6 trainers, he'll understand that the injury was simply an accident, a moment of bad weather and bad luck, and not a reflection of any real failure on either of our parts." It was a hope she clung to fiercely in the days that followed, even as the calendar continued its relentless march toward the Duke's expected arrival. Titan's leg improved steadily under their careful attention, the swelling long since subsided, his gait growing steadier and more confident with each passing day, though a careful observer might still notice a slight hesitation, a barely perceptible favoring of the previously injured limb during moments of sudden movement or turning. 10 days after Samuel had first shared news of the Duke's impending return, Alara judged that Titan was finally ready to attempt a full ride again, the first since the storm that had so nearly ended in tragedy. She approached the moment with the same careful patience that had guided every stage of their relationship, walking him first at a slow pace around the paddock, testing his comfort and confidence before finally, cautiously, mounting him for a gentle trot across the same fields where they had once ridden so freely together in the pale light of dawn. Titan moved beneath her with steady, sure strides, no trace of his earlier limp visible in his confident gait, and Alara felt tears of relief and joy gathering in her eyes as she realized, with growing certainty, that he had truly, fully recovered. She guided him into a gentle canter, testing his strength and endurance, and felt him respond with the same eager, trusting energy that had characterized their earlier rides before the storm had so cruelly interrupted their progress. "You did it," she whispered to him as they slowed to a walk near the edge of the field, patting his neck affectionately. "You're healed and you're stronger than ever. Whatever happens when the Duke arrives, we've done everything we possibly could to prepare for this moment." She returned to the stable that evening with a lighter heart than she had carried in weeks, cautiously optimistic that Titan's remarkable recovery, combined with the genuine trust and skill she had built with him over these past months, would be enough to convince the Duke that his prized stallion had finally found the right person to unlock his true potential. Samuel, observing their ride from a distance, confirmed her assessment with an approving nod, noting that Titan's stride showed no lingering weakness, his recovery as complete as anyone could have reasonably hoped for given the severity of his initial injury. But even as her confidence grew, a new worry began to take shape in Alara's mind, one she had not fully considered until now. She had spent months building a private, secret bond with Titan, one built on quiet nights and early morning rides hidden from the world's judgment and expectation. Soon, that private world would be exposed entirely to the scrutiny of a man whose opinion would determine not just Titan's future but her own as well. What if the very qualities that had made their bond so successful, the patience, the quiet, the absence of pressure or expectation, could not survive the sudden intrusion of an audience, of judgment, of the Duke's own presence and authority looming over what had always been, until now, an intensely private relationship? She pushed these worries aside as best she could, focusing instead on the practical work of ensuring Titan remained calm and confident in the days leading up to the Duke's arrival. She introduced small changes gradually, accustoming him to the presence of more people in the stable yard during her daily routines, careful never to push too quickly or risk undoing the careful progress of the preceding months through hasty overconfidence. Word had begun to spread quietly among the rest of the household staff about the remarkable transformation in Titan's temperament, though most still did not know the full details of how such a change had come about. Whispers circulated in the kitchen and among the field workers, speculation about what magic or method had finally tamed the beast that had defeated so many trained professionals. Alara found herself the subject of curious glances during her daily chores, glances she had never received before in all her years of quiet, unremarkable service at Whitmore Hall. She did not know quite how to feel about this sudden, unwanted attention, accustomed as she was to moving through her days largely unnoticed by those around her. Part of her wished fiercely that her work with Titan could have remained entirely private, a secret joy shared only between herself and the horse who had become, over these many months, the truest companion of her young life. But she understood, with growing acceptance, that the time for secrecy was rapidly drawing to a close, and that whatever came next would require her to step, for the first time in her life, into a kind of visibility she had never sought or expected. 3 days before the Duke's letter indicated his expected arrival, a rider appeared at the estate's main gate bearing urgent news that sent a fresh jolt of alarm through the entire household. The Duke, it seemed, had concluded his business even more swiftly than anticipated, and rather than arriving in 3 days as previously indicated, intended instead to reach Whitmore Hall the very next morning. Alara received this news while standing in Titan's stall, brush in hand, and felt the careful preparation of the preceding weeks suddenly collapse into a single, overwhelming rush of anxiety. Tomorrow. The Duke would arrive tomorrow, with barely any time remaining to prepare for whatever confrontation, whatever judgment, awaited them both. That night, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, Alara made her way down to Titan's stall one final time before the world as she knew it changed irrevocably. She sat beside him in the familiar darkness, running her hands along his neck in the same gentle, patient manner that had first begun to earn his trust so many months earlier, and spoke to him softly of everything that had brought them to this moment. "Tomorrow, everyone will finally see what I've seen all along," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper in the quiet stable. "They'll see how strong you are, how gentle, how far you've come from the frightened, angry horse everyone believed you to be. Whatever happens, whatever the Duke decides, I want you to know that these months with you have meant more to me than almost anything else in my life. You gave me something I didn't even know I was searching for." Titan lowered his great head and rested it gently against her shoulder, a gesture of trust and affection that had become familiar over their months together, but that felt, on this particular night, more significant than ever before. Alara wrapped her arms around his neck and allowed herself, finally, to release some of the fear and uncertainty she had been carrying for weeks, letting the tears fall freely in the quiet darkness of the stable, comforted by the steady, patient presence of the horse who had taught her, in turn, so much about the power of quiet patience and unconditional trust. Tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring. Tonight, in the darkness of the familiar stable, surrounded by the quiet sounds of horses settling for sleep and the steady, comforting warmth of Titan's presence beside her, Alara allowed herself one final moment of peace before the momentous events that awaited them both with the rising of the sun. The Duke's carriage arrived at Whitmore Hall earlier than anyone had expected, rolling through the main gate, while the morning mist still clung low across the fields, and most of the household staff had barely begun their daily preparations. Edmund Whitmore stepped down from the carriage with the brisk, purposeful energy of a man eager to address the many matters that had accumulated in his absence, his sharp eyes already scanning the estate grounds with the assessing gaze of someone accustomed to noticing every detail out of place. He had traveled through the night rather than stopping at the usual inn along the route, driven by an impatience he could not fully explain even to himself, a restless urgency to finally resolve the question of his troublesome stallion that had been weighing on his mind throughout his long months abroad. He had half expected to arrive and find the horse sold already, or perhaps injured beyond recovery through some further training accident, and he found himself bracing for disappointing news even as he strode toward the stable yard without waiting for his steward to announce his arrival. What he saw instead, as he rounded the corner of the main stable building, stopped him completely in his tracks. In the paddock beyond, bathed in the soft golden light of early morning, his infamous black stallion moved in slow, graceful circles, calm and controlled, carrying upon his back a young woman whose posture radiated a confidence and ease that seemed entirely impossible given everything he had been told about the animal's violent temperament. The Duke stood frozen at the edge of the yard, unable for a long moment to reconcile the peaceful scene before him, with the letters he had received describing 6 failed training attempts and a horse too dangerous to safely approach. Arri, unaware of the Duke's unexpected early arrival, continued her gentle exercise with Titan, guiding him through a series of smooth transitions between walk and trot, entirely absorbed in the quiet rhythm of their movement together. It was only when Titan's ears suddenly pricked forward, his attention caught by some new presence at the edge of the paddock, that Arri followed his gaze and felt her heart stop entirely at the sight of a tall, well-dressed stranger watching them with an expression of complete, stunned astonishment. She knew immediately, with a certainty that needed no introduction, exactly who stood before her. The fine cut of his traveling coat, the authoritative bearing that seemed to command attention even in his stillness, the way the few staff members who had noticed his arrival immediately straightened and lowered their eyes in deference, all confirmed what her racing heart had already suspected. This was Edmund Whitmore, Duke of Whitmore Hall, the owner of the horse she had spent months secretly training, arrived without warning at precisely the moment she had least prepared herself to face him. For a long, breathless moment, neither of them moved. Arri sat frozen atop Titan in the middle of the paddock, uncertain whether to dismount immediately or wait for some signal from the man watching her with such evident shock. The Duke, for his part, seemed equally unable to process the scene before him, his mind struggling to reconcile the calm, obedient horse he was witnessing with every report he had received describing a creature too wild and dangerous to be safely approached. It was Samuel, arriving hurriedly at the sound of the Duke's carriage and taking in the scene before him with a mixture of relief and apprehension, who finally broke the tense silence. "Your Grace," he called out, hurrying toward the paddock fence, "you've returned earlier than we expected." The Duke turned at the sound of Samuel's voice, though his gaze kept drifting back, almost involuntarily, to the extraordinary sight of his stallion moving so calmly beneath its young rider. "Samuel," he said, his voice carrying the careful control of a man determined not to reveal too much surprise before he understood the full situation, "perhaps you would care to explain what exactly I am witnessing here." Samuel glanced briefly toward Arri, who had finally begun to guide Titan toward the paddock gate, her expression a careful mixture of nervousness and determination as she prepared to face whatever judgment awaited her. "That, Your Grace," Samuel said, choosing his words with obvious care, "is a story I believe would be better told by the young woman herself, though I can assure you of one thing before she speaks. Everything you are seeing before you is entirely real, and entirely earned through her own patient, dedicated work these past several months." Arri dismounted at the edge of the paddock, her legs slightly unsteady as she approached the fence where the Duke stood waiting, Titan following close behind her, with the same trusting attentiveness he had shown throughout their ride. She had imagined this moment countless times over the preceding weeks, rehearsing various explanations and justifications for her secret training, but standing now before the actual man himself, all her careful preparation seemed to desert her entirely. "Your Grace," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, dropping into a careful curtsy despite the mud still clinging to her boots and the dew dampening the hem of her simple work dress. "My name is Arri Bennett. I have worked in your stables for 11 years since I was a child of 9. The Duke studied her carefully, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of her appearance, From her simple, practical clothing to the calm, steady way she stood before him despite what must have been considerable anxiety at facing his unexpected scrutiny. "And you are the one responsible for whatever transformation I have just witnessed in my stallion?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral, giving no indication yet of whether he viewed this development with approval or displeasure. "Yes, Your Grace," Alara said, meeting his gaze directly despite every instinct urging her to look away in deference. "I began working with him in secret several months ago, after watching your trainers fail repeatedly, and coming to believe that his behavior stemmed not from a genuinely vicious temperament but from fear, born of rough treatment before he ever arrived at Whitmore Hall. I know I should have sought permission before attempting to work with him myself. I understand if you are displeased with the secrecy of my methods." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his gaze shifting between Alara and the calm Stallion standing patiently beside her, occasionally nudging her shoulder with obvious affection in a manner that seemed to confirm everything she had just told him about the depth of trust they had built together. "6 trainers," he said finally, almost to himself. 6 professional trainers, each more experienced and better credentialed than the last, and not one of them managed what you have apparently accomplished, working alone in secret without any formal training of your own. "I don't believe formal training was what he needed, Your Grace," Alara said carefully. "I believe he needed patience and time, and someone willing to earn his trust rather than demand his obedience. I spent many nights simply sitting near his stall, asking nothing of him, until he came to understand that I posed no threat to him." The Duke's expression remained difficult to read, and Alara felt her anxiety mounting with each passing second of his continued silence. She glanced briefly at Samuel, seeking some reassurance in his expression, but the old groom's face showed only the same careful, watchful uncertainty that gripped her own thoughts as they awaited the Duke's judgment. "Show me," the Duke said finally, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity that had not been present in his earlier, more guarded tone. "I have received months of reports describing an animal too dangerous to approach. I would like to see for myself what you have accomplished, before I form any judgment about how this situation ought to be addressed." Relief flooded through Alara at these words, and she nodded quickly, turning back toward Titan and preparing to remount him for the Duke's direct observation. But before she could do so, the Duke surprised her entirely by stepping closer to the paddock fence, his sharp eyes studying the stallion with renewed interest. "May I approach him?" he asked, a question Alara had not expected from a man of his standing, accustomed as he surely was to commanding rather than requesting permission for anything he wished to do on his own estate. "Slowly, Your Grace," Alara advised, stepping back slightly to give both the Duke and Titan space to assess each other. "He is still cautious around unfamiliar people, though far less so than he once was. If you approach calmly, without sudden movement, I believe he will allow you closer than you might expect." The Duke nodded and moved forward with careful, measured steps, extending one hand slowly toward Titan's nose in the same manner. Alara had taught herself through months of patient observation and trial. Titan's ears flicked warily at the unfamiliar approach, and for a tense moment, Alara held her breath, uncertain whether the stallion's newfound trust extended far enough to accept the very man whose ownership had, in some indirect sense, been responsible for the circumstances that had shaped his fearful temperament in the first place. But Titan, after a moment of careful consideration, lowered his head slightly and allowed the Duke's outstretched hand to make contact with his nose, accepting the unfamiliar touch with a calm tolerance that clearly astonished the man standing before him. The Duke's careful, guarded expression finally broke into something closer to genuine wonder, his hand moving slowly along the stallion's neck as he processed the reality of what he was experiencing firsthand. "Remarkable," he murmured, almost to himself, his earlier reserve giving way entirely to open amazement. "In all my years I have never seen anything quite like this." He turned back to Alara, his expression now carrying a warmth and respect that had been entirely absent from his initial guarded assessment. "I believe, Miss Bennet," he said, that you and I have a great deal to discuss regarding both this remarkable horse and your own considerable, previously unrecognized talents." That afternoon, the Duke called Alara to the main house for a formal conversation, a summons that filled her with fresh nervousness despite the encouraging warmth he had shown in the paddock earlier that morning. She had never once, in 11 years of service at Whitmore Hall, been invited into the main house for any purpose beyond delivering messages to the kitchen staff, and she found herself acutely conscious of her simple, worn clothing, as she was led through hallways far grander than anything she had encountered in her sheltered life among the stables. The Duke received her in his study, a room lined with books and hunting trophies that spoke of generations of family history and privilege entirely foreign to her own humble upbringing. He gestured for her to sit in the chair opposite his desk, a small courtesy that nonetheless struck her as remarkable given the vast gulf in station between them. "I have spoken further with Samuel this afternoon," the Duke began, once she had settled somewhat uncomfortably into the offered seat. "He has told me a great deal about your work with Titan these past months, details I confess I found difficult to fully credit until I witnessed the results myself this morning. I hope, Your Grace, that you understand my intentions were never to deceive you," Alara said carefully. "I simply feared that, if I asked permission before I had proven the method could succeed, I would be refused before ever having the chance to try." "A reasonable fear, given the circumstances," the Duke acknowledged, leaning back in his chair with an expression of thoughtful consideration. "I confess I had already begun to consider whether the horse might need to be destroyed if his temperament could not be improved before the season's end. The expense of maintaining a dangerous, unusable animal was becoming difficult to justify, however much I admired his bloodline and appearance." Alara felt a chill at these words, understanding now, more clearly than ever, how narrow the margin had been between Titan's continued survival and a far darker fate that her secret intervention had ultimately prevented. "I'm grateful, Your Grace, that circumstances allowed me the time needed to prove another path was possible." "As am I," the Duke said, and something in his tone suggested genuine sincerity behind the formal words. "Tell me, Miss Bennet, where did you learn such methods?" "Samuel tells me you had no formal training in horsemanship beyond your years working in the stables." "I had no teacher beyond the horses themselves, Your Grace," Alara admitted. "I simply learned to watch closely, to notice what frightened them and what comforted them, and to trust that patience would eventually accomplish what force could not. My parents died when I was young, and horses became, in many ways, the only steady companions I had during difficult years. Perhaps that shared understanding of loss and uncertainty helped me recognize something similar in Titan's own troubled history." The Duke was quiet for a moment, studying her with an expression that had shifted from simple curiosity into something closer to genuine respect. "I find myself in an unusual position," he said finally. "I came home prepared to make a difficult decision about an animal I believed to be a costly failure. Instead, I find that failure transformed into perhaps the finest horse in the county, through the efforts of a member of my own household staff, whose talents I had never once thought to recognize or inquire after." "I only did what seemed right, Your Grace," Alara said quietly. "I never expected recognition for it." "And that perhaps is precisely why you deserve it," the Duke replied. "I would like to offer you a formal position, Miss Bennet, as head trainer for my stables, with authority over Titan's continued development and oversight of any future horses requiring similar patient handling. The position would come with appropriate compensation, quarters befitting your new responsibilities, and my full confidence in your judgment regarding matters of horsemanship on this estate." Alara stared at him, momentarily speechless at the magnitude of what he was offering. Head trainer, a position she had never dared imagine for herself, given not merely as reward but as genuine acknowledgement of skills she had spent years developing in obscurity, unnoticed and unrewarded by anyone beyond herself, and more recently, the horse who had become her closest companion. "I don't know what to say, Your Grace," she managed finally. "I am deeply honored. I accept gladly, and I promise to justify whatever trust you place in me." "I have no doubt of that," the Duke said, a small smile finally breaking through his earlier formal reserve. "Given what I witnessed this morning, I suspect you have already justified it many times over, long before I ever thought to offer you the recognition you deserved." The weeks that followed brought a transformation to Alara's life as dramatic, in its own way, as the transformation she had helped bring about in Titan himself. She moved from the humble hay loft where she had slept for so many years into proper quarters near the main stable building, quarters that, while still modest by the standards of the main house, felt luxurious beyond anything she had previously known. Her new position brought with it not only material comfort, but a level of respect and recognition from the other staff that had been entirely absent during her years as an unremarkable stable girl. Cedric, delighted by her success and genuinely proud of the role he had played in supporting her secret work during those crucial early months, was promoted to serve as her primary assistant, a position he embraced with enthusiasm and genuine dedication to learning the patient methods she continued to refine through her ongoing work with Titan and the other horses under her expanded care. The Duke, for his part, began spending considerably more time at Whitmore Hall than had been his previous habit, drawn perhaps by genuine curiosity about the remarkable progress continuing to unfold in his stables, though Alara noticed, with growing awareness, that his visits to observe Titan's training often extended well beyond what pure professional interest might reasonably require. He began seeking her counsel not merely on matters relating to the horses, but on broader questions of estate management, finding in her careful, thoughtful perspective a quality of judgment he had rarely encountered among his more formally educated advisors. Their conversations, initially limited to practical matters of horsemanship, gradually expanded to encompass wider subjects, and Alara found herself, to her own considerable surprise, genuinely enjoying the Duke's company beyond the professional respect she had initially extended toward him. He possessed, she discovered, a genuine curiosity about the world that belied his sometimes formal, reserved public manner, and a willingness to listen carefully to perspectives quite different from his own privileged upbringing. "I confess," he told her one afternoon, as they stood together watching Titan graze peacefully in the same paddock where their extraordinary first meeting had taken place, "that I find myself looking forward to my visits here more than almost any other obligation on my calendar these days." Alara felt warmth rise in her cheeks at these words, uncertain quite how to interpret the growing familiarity that had developed between them over the preceding weeks. "The stables have always been a source of comfort to me as well, Your Grace," she said carefully, choosing her words with deliberate ambiguity. "Edmund," he said quietly, "please, when we are alone like this, I would prefer you call me Edmund, rather than by my title." The request carried an intimacy that Alara had not expected, and she glanced at him with new understanding, recognizing in his careful, almost hesitant tone something that mirrored the same cautious vulnerability she had once worked so patiently to draw out from the frightened stallion now grazing peacefully before them both. "Edmund," she repeated softly, testing the name and finding, to her own quiet surprise, that she liked the sound of it. Their friendship, and the deepening affection that gradually grew alongside it, developed with the same patient, unhurried care that had characterized Alara's approach to every relationship she valued in her life, whether with a frightened, wounded horse, or with a man whose position and privilege might have suggested an entirely different, more formal path toward whatever connection might eventually develop between them. Neither rushed toward declarations or expectations, neither felt fully ready to make content, instead to allow their bond to strengthen naturally through shared time, shared conversation, and a growing mutual respect that neither had quite anticipated when their unlikely story began on that rain-soaked morning of the Duke's unexpected return. Titan, meanwhile, continued to flourish under Alara's continued care, his transformation from feared, dangerous animal into the finest, most reliable horse in the county becoming something of a local legend in its own right. Visitors who had once traveled to Whitmore Hall merely to gawk at the notorious untamable Stallion now came instead to witness his remarkable calm, his gentle responsiveness, and the extraordinary bond he shared with the young woman who had once been dismissed as merely a stable girl, but who had proven herself, through patience and dedication, to be one of the finest horsewomen the county had ever known. As the autumn deepened into winter, and the fields around Whitmore Hall grew quiet beneath the season's first frosts, Elara often found herself reflecting on the improbable journey that had brought her to this point, from an orphan child taken in out of simple charity, to an unremarkable stable girl overlooked by nearly everyone around her, to a respected trainer whose skills had transformed not only a single horse's fate but her own future as well. She thought, too, of the quiet nights that had begun it all, sitting patiently beside a frightened, wounded animal, asking nothing of him beyond the simple gift of her presence, and understood with growing clarity that the same patient trust she had offered Titan had ultimately opened doors in her own life she had never dared to imagine might exist. Spring arrived at Whitmore Hall with a gentleness that seemed to mirror the changes that had taken root throughout the estate over the preceding months. The fields that had once been the site of a terrifying storm and near tragedy now bloomed with fresh grass and wildflowers, and Titan, fully recovered and stronger than ever, spent his mornings racing across the open ground, with a joy and freedom that delighted everyone fortunate enough to witness it. Elara's reputation as a trainer had grown steadily throughout the winter months, and neighboring estates had begun sending inquiries, asking whether she might be persuaded to assist with their own difficult horses, animals that other trainers had given up on entirely. She approached each new case with the same patient philosophy that had first transformed Titan, refusing to rely on force or fear, insisting instead on understanding the root causes of each animal's troubled behavior before attempting any kind of correction. Cedric had grown into a genuinely skilled assistant trainer under her patient mentorship, developing an intuition for horses that rivaled her own, though he readily acknowledged that he owed his growing expertise entirely to the lessons she had first taught him during those secret nighttime sessions so many months earlier. Their early rivalry had transformed completely into a genuine partnership, built on mutual respect and a shared passion for the careful, compassionate work they now practiced together. Samuel, watching the transformation of both his stables and his two young proteges with evident pride, had begun speaking of eventual retirement, confident that he was leaving the future of Whitmore Hall's horses in capable, dedicated hands. He often remarked, to anyone who would listen, that the finest decision he had ever made was allowing a curious young orphan girl to spend her early years surrounded by the horses she so clearly loved, though he was quick to add that he could claim no credit for the extraordinary gift she had brought to that opportunity entirely on her own. The relationship between Elara and the Duke had continued its slow, careful development throughout the winter, each visit bringing them closer together, in ways that neither had anticipated when their story first began. Edmund found himself increasingly drawn not merely to Elara's evident skill with horses, but to her thoughtful perspective on matters far beyond the stable walls, her quiet wisdom informed by a life of hardship and careful observation that offered him insights he rarely encountered among the more privileged circles of his usual acquaintance. It was on a warm evening in early summer, nearly a full year after that first fateful storm, that Edmund finally spoke the words that had been building steadily between them through months of careful, patient connection. They stood together in the same paddock where their story had truly begun, watching the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and gold behind the distant tree line, Titan grazing peacefully nearby, his presence a constant, comforting reminder of everything that had brought them to this particular moment. "Elara," Edmund said, turning to face her with an expression of careful vulnerability that reminded her, not for the first time, of the same tentative trust she had once worked so patiently to earn from the magnificent Stallion now standing beside them both. "I have come to realize, over these past months, that my feelings for you extend far beyond simple admiration for your evident skill and dedication. I find myself, quite unexpectedly, deeply and genuinely in love with you." Alara felt her heart swell with an emotion she had been carefully guarding against fully acknowledging, even to herself, throughout the slow, careful development of their friendship. "Edmund," she said softly, "I confess I have felt something similar growing within my own heart these many months, though I hardly dared hope you might feel the same in return." "Then you would consider," he said, his voice carrying a hopeful uncertainty that belied his usual confident bearing, "allowing me to court you properly, with every intention of eventually making our connection permanent, should you find yourself willing to accept such a future alongside me." Tears gathered in Alara's eyes, born not of sadness, but of an overwhelming joy she had never expected to find in her own uncertain, difficult life. "Yes," she said simply, "I would consider that a great honor and an even greater joy." Their courtship, once formally established, proceeded with the same patient care that had characterized every meaningful relationship in Alara's life, whether with the horses she had always loved so deeply, or with the man who had gradually come to understand and value her in ways she had never expected any person of his standing to genuinely appreciate. Whispers of their growing attachment spread quickly through the county, met with a mixture of surprise and, increasingly, genuine approval, as more and more people came to recognize the extraordinary character and skill that had first drawn the Duke's attention toward a simple stable girl who had accomplished what no trained professional could manage. They were married the following spring, exactly 2 years after the storm that had first brought their unlikely story to its critical turning point, in a ceremony held, at Alara's specific request, in the very paddock where Titan had first allowed her onto his back so many months earlier. The magnificent stallion, groomed to a gleaming shine for the occasion, stood as a witness to their vows, a living testament to the patient, unconditional trust that had transformed not merely his own troubled fate, but the entire course of Alara's remarkable life as well. In the years that followed, Alara continued her work training horses throughout the county, her reputation growing into something approaching legend among those who understood the true difficulty of what she had accomplished with Titan, and the many other troubled animals who came to benefit from her patient, compassionate methods. She and Edmund raised a family together at Whitmore Hall, their children growing up surrounded by horses just as Alara herself had, though under far happier and more secure circumstances than her own difficult childhood had provided. Titan lived out the remainder of his days at Whitmore Hall, beloved not merely as the Duke's prized stallion, but as a cherished member of the family in every meaningful sense, his once fearsome reputation transformed entirely into local legend, as the horse whose remarkable rehabilitation had brought together an unlikely couple and reshaped the future of an entire estate. Visitors who came to Whitmore Hall in later years, hearing the story of the untamable stallion and the quiet stable girl who alone had understood how to reach him, often struggled to reconcile the gentle, dignified horse they encountered with the wild, dangerous creature described in the old, half-forgotten tales. But Alara, watching her own children learn to ride upon Titan steady, patient back in the same fields where her own extraordinary journey had first begun, understood better than anyone the true nature of the transformation that had unfolded at Whitmore Hall. It had never truly been about taming a wild and dangerous animal. It had always, from the very first quiet night in the darkened stable, been about patience and trust, and the willingness to see past fear and reputation toward the gentle, trusting heart that had been waiting, all along, for someone patient enough to finally discover it.